gaps and where it makes sense going forward. So what I hear everybody say is active recreation may be a lesser priority than the more natural and historic resource protection areas, which pertains more to goals, more to the trails, more to just general forest and streams and that type of open space.
But I think we also said that, you know, when we get to active recreation, we want to look at what we have and say, could we use it better?
Could we use it better? Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. And then I think the ag heritage is still a yes.
Yes.
Everyone wants to say the farms. Okay, so I wanted to get that clarified before we moved on to looking at specific tactics for any of these. So I'll take over again.
So now we're just going to look at some broad strategies for implementing those goals. So we can start with the growth management. And this one is, so again, this is an important distinction to make, and it might have been made in the past. Because we've been calling this a comprehensive plan, and it's going to include all the elements that are typically in a comprehensive plan. But Lower Frederick has a comprehensive plan. The Central Perkiomen Valley Regional Comprehensive Plan is your legal and official comprehensive plan. We're not changing that. That's still going to remain in place. But those plans basically are sort of that 50,000-foot view of what Lower Frederick should be. There's only two basic land use categories in the Central Perk Regional Plan that apply to Lower Frederick: rural resource area and secondary growth. So what does that mean? So what does that mean in terms of how the development is shown up in the development plan for the designated growth or for the rural resource? And that's what this study will do. This more detailed land use study, a more neighborhood level comprehensive plan is going to get to that detail of what does it really look like on the ground in Lower Frederick within that broad category that's established by the regional plan. So I think when we talk about growth management, that's what the regional plan does very well, is drawn growth boundaries for where we want rural resource protection and where we're going to allow for some additional growth, because that's where the sewer facilities are, that's what the water facilities are, that's where we have the better roads that probably still need to be improved in some way, but that's where we have the opportunity for additional growth to take place. And so I think when you talk about growth management, continuing to work with and implement the regional comprehensive plan is probably sort of the number one strategy for that. There are some other things that you can do on a township level that I think have been mentioned in the past and have been identified in the open space plan. The first of those you already have, and that would be sort of what Jack had talked about, is that conservation subdivision, that cluster option. That's also a good growth management tool, and that's something you already have in your zoning. It's called neighborhood lotting. And you have the environmental adjustment factors that sort of, based on how much floodplains, wetlands, steep slopes are on the property, the carrying capacity, the number of homes you can get on that property, is reduced. And then you can focus it on one side or the other and get 50%, 60% preservation of that property. So I think continuing to work with it and see if you can improve your neighborhood lotting is probably another strategy, just to sort of evaluate how has it worked in the developments that have applied it. Are there improvements that can be made to it? Is the percentage of open space still what you want? Is it high enough? Is it too high for some reason? And so analyzing that, I think, is something to look at. And then transfer development rights. It's probably the pinnacle of a growth management tool, because it literally will take potential development from the rural resource areas, permanently preserve that property, and apply that development to the growth area. And so you're actually taking potential development from the rural resource area, leaving that area undeveloped, and putting it, again, where you have the infrastructure for additional development to take place. And so that's something that I know has been looked at in the past, but that should probably be further evaluated. And I know there's some potential of actually looking at that on sort of a parcel basis as well.
Eric, let me just point.
Okay.
One thing we have to keep in mind when we talk about growth management does not mean stopping growth. We have, like Kate said earlier, we can't deny property owners the right to do something with their property according to what the zoning allows. So I think we have to make sure that everybody understands that growth management doesn't mean stopping all development. We will definitely have some development in our community going forward. You can't deny that that's going to happen, and in 20 years it's definitely going to happen. And now that we've got sewer capacity, that's just another push in the way of development. But the growth management part of it comes into what techniques do you use to ensure that the development that comes into your community goes where you want it to go, where you have the facilities, the roads, the sewer, the community network, and it doesn't get plopped out in the middle of the open field someplace where you've got really long sewer runs to maintain, you've got really long roads to maintain. By keeping all that growth close in, your costs of maintenance are lower over time, and you build a community rather than having people scattered all over in communities named after the farm that used to be there. So
Protect the farms, protect the stream valleys.
right, so keep that in mind. We're not talking about stopping all development. We can't do that. But we're talking about techniques to use to focus development where we want it to occur.
All right, one of the most important things that I took away from Kate's talk was when she mentioned the neighborhood lighting. I think that's something that we really, really do need to take a look at here with our comprehensive plan, is look at the things that she mentioned with the neighborhood lighting and adjust our ordinances for the practical reasons that she said. So that the open space that gets preserved by this is actually useful and not just perimeters of properties or something like that where the people are just going to dump their yard waste.
So one thing on that, and because this is both a local example and then it goes back to your regional comprehensive plan. So Upper Southford, since I think 1998, has had conservation subdivision on the books as well. And they require 60% of every property over 10 acres get preserved and the development person on the other 40. And they were concerned about that back then is, well, how do we keep from just getting the crappy land that the developer didn't want to build on as part of that 60%? How do we get the best land possible? So they undertook a greenway analysis where they looked at every property over 10 acres, looked at what it had on it in terms of the wetlands, the steep slopes, the woodlands, the farmland. And in certain parts of the township, they prioritized farmland. Certain parts, they would prioritize woodlands. But they basically went in and predetermined for every 10-acre property, what's the best 60% of this property that we want to see preserved for rural resource protection, for natural resource protection. That's what we want to see preserved. And more importantly, as properties get developed across time, those 60% are going to match up and form an actual greenway system as opposed to a patchwork of open space if they would have gotten developed by themselves, sort of, in a vacuum. So we took that in terms of the regional plan, and we've done that for the regional area. We've looked at every property over 10 acres in Lower Frederick, Upper Frederick, Perkiomen, that's still undeveloped, and predetermined the 50% that should be preserved from a rural resource and natural resource protection perspective. And so that's done. And what you can do, and what Upper Southford did in their zoning, is they basically said, we have this study, you have to adhere to this study when you develop the property. And so this is the 60% you want. And there's nothing wrong with that, because the developer just wants to be sure they can get their homes. And so if they can get the homes they're entitled to on that 40%, they don't care what 40% they give to you, or what 60% they give to you. And so I think that's something that we already have. And so implementing or working with the regional greenway plan to use as a starting point for identification of those preserved lands as part of the neighborhood lotting would be something that we want to look at further. Because that's exactly
our first couple of cluster plans come in.
And that's exactly the thing, when cluster got started and called cluster back in the late 80s and early 90s, a few bad ones turned everybody off from the idea of cluster. It doesn't work, it didn't do anything good here, now we have some small lots and crappy open space. Let's go back to the big lots and just be done with it. And so you got to make sure it gets done right. And the community's getting something from that development. You're not just you're protecting the resources you want to protect, but also that they're going to work together. There's no sense preserving as part of the stream valley here, and the next parcel over, it gets developed. For water quality, you need to make sure that you have a riparian buffer along the full length of that stream. So I think that there are things that we can evaluate. I mean, you're way ahead of the game. In fact, you have neighborhood lotting on the books. There's still these guys that don't even allow neighborhood lotting in the cluster. So you've already done a really good job, but I think that there are probably improvements that can be made through a little bit of analysis.
Sorry, so you said they have it in their codes, what would that be called?
It's just in their zoning. So in their zoning, where they allow for conservation subdivision, they have standards for how that development should be met. So just like they have the lot sizes shall be, no smaller than 10,000 square feet, the open space shall be adhered to the Greenway guideline. So they have to, in the zoning code itself.
They reference another document, is that it?
Yep. Yep. And so municipalities have done that in the past with design guidelines. A lot of downtowns do that. So if you're going to develop in the Main Street area, they'll have storefront design standards or a streetscape design standard that you have to adhere to as you develop that property. So yeah, there's precedent for that. So I think from growth management, I think that's what we're looking at as a starting point for the recommendations. And this won't be the end of the conversation. As I said, we're going to take this information and put it into some actual language, an actual chapter, if you will. And so at that point, we'll be able to go back and rehash these issues a little bit, or see if, as we read more about it, if we miss something that's important to Little Frederick. So this is just to give us that beginning framework to write that chapter out. So what's the next goal? Let's look at just the natural and resource protection. And the natural and historic resource protection, natural amenities. I think there's a couple there that we want to look at. I think the repairing border is one. And a lot of these, again, have been identified in both regional plan, I think in past open space plans. So it's not new, but it's still something that you need to be thinking about. Particularly as every municipality has if you know what an MS4 permit is, DEP requires every municipality to think about how they're going to get rid of their stormwater and trying to keep the streams clean. Because if they get impaired, if they don't meet their water quality standards, you're going to spend a lot of money to clean up that water. So it's a lot cheaper to keep it clean than to clean it up after it's gotten dirty. And the best way to do that is repairing buffers to protect the stream border on both sides of the stream from sediment running into it, from the phosphorus and nutrients that are attached to that sediment getting into the stream. So repairing buffers is something you want to think about. And we've had municipalities that have done it all sorts of ways. I think that 7,500 foot is sort of that maximum number that you need. After that, you start getting diminishing returns on the benefits. But you need at least that full 75 feet. Some municipalities have only done 50. In our developed communities, they provide a little bit more flexible standards because they have some homes that are already within 20 feet of the stream, so you need to be flexible. So there are ways to design the ordinance to reflect, how the streams are developed in your community already. Luckily, you still have a lot of open stream valleys that you can get the full protection from. But there is flexibility that might be in some of the village areas that you already have.
Eric, I have a question about the wetland conservation. There's just been in the news recently a conversation at the federal level to reduce the wetland requirements for part of the Clean Water Act. If the feds reduce the requirements at the federal level, how strong can our restrictions on wetland destruction be at the local level?
Well, so are they changing what the definition of a wetland is?
I think they're separating wetlands from clean water altogether. It's not clear yet.
So the municipalities can still go further. That's probably going to affect federal permits, definitely, on whether you can fill them in and how you can manage them. But same with the streams, that's still streams and waters are common. So they're still also protected under the streams law in Pennsylvania. So you can still require a buffer around them. They do have privacy on the filling in, so that might come into play, that you can't prevent it from being filled in.
You can't have stronger restrictions than
Not on the wetlands permit, because that's a privacy on that. But again, you can get buffers around them. Now, again, they fill it in before. It's hard to say. I guess you're sort of stuck with how the feds want to regulate it.
Yeah, I think one of the things we want to talk about in this plan is how we retain a sustainable community going forward. And we saw the flooding up in Green Lane not too long ago. Well, that was a pretty unique kind of storm. It dumped a lot of water really fast. It still kind of reflects the lack of wetland and floodplain area that's available to absorb those big storms when they happen. So one of my concerns is that we have enough protections in our natural resource protections that we have space for big water when it comes. It doesn't include taking people's houses with it.
Yeah, so a lot of that, again, floodplain, FEMA has a floodplain ordinance.
Right.
Everybody updated back in 2016.
Yeah.
So that's certainly a big benefit, but the repairing buffers on top of that.
Yeah, so whatever we can do to maximize that, I think is.
And I think that part of the problem is that we're going to start seeing, you know, some of the changes in weather patterns. We're starting to see those types of heavy rains more frequently. And heavier rains. So that's just something that we have to be more cognizant of.
Yeah, we want to prevent, it's like Spring Mountain, from getting flooded out in the future. We need to do something to give the water someplace to go. Besides.
And that was one of my other things I jotted down as potential, is also to, you know, as part of the stormwater management and water quality, but encouraging infiltration of stormwater. And probably a lot of the development, any development that in Lower Frederick that occurred before probably 1985 or so, didn't have any stormwater controls. So the water just runs off the property and into the storm drain and down to the creek. So anything that we can go back and try to work with homeowners to do infiltration, hurricane watershed concerns, I guess rain hero workshops all the time, you know, to hold that water so it doesn't get off your property until well after the storm is through. Those are things that we can do now to sort of diminish the amount of water that's rushing into the stream and potentially flooding people downstream even further. So that might be something too, is you know, working with the watershed concerns, because they're working with their municipality. So in some cases, you know, Green Lane, that problem probably wasn't really caused by Green Lane development. That was the water coming down the McCovey Creek or above them that caused that problem. So the development there didn't hold the water back enough, had too much running off of it. So you sort of need to think a little more regionally sometimes about the stormwater as well.
And to that effect, open space preservation and agricultural preservation is a big part of protecting the stream valleys and communities downstream by catching the water where it falls.
Yep. And that's another one of those benefits of preserving land, too, right? It's not going to become a parking lot. It's not going to become a bunch of houses with roofs causing runoff. It's going to hopefully be a sink for runoff because water's going to infiltrate into the ground, which again is better for water quality because it keeps the streams running, you know, as in the dry periods, as they're being fed from that groundwater through the infiltration.
Are there any ways that you can calculate or understand, like where you should develop and how much you should develop to have that balance with stormwater management? I mean, can you look at a community locally to understand when you have heavy rains, where's the weather to go, and maybe not do a lot of development in those areas?
I think you're talking more about the riparian areas, because it's where the creeks converge, is where you get problems, big problems. There's a lot of runoff just in general, but riparian buffers would be big, the floodplains definitely are big, buffers around the floodplains would be important. Steep slopes are important because water runs off faster there if it's developed. So I don't know if you can do an analysis per se of like acre per acre, what should be developed or not. But if we look at the most special natural areas and keep them as natural as possible, that's a huge first step in addressing stormwater going forward.
Timing is the other issue. So it is one thing they do computer modeling for, is that certain parts of the stream, how fast the water gets from their property downstream to a point, and you look for convergence points, and that's where sometimes the problems are, is because the development over here and the development over here got to the same point at the same time. And so through that modeling, they said, okay, well, this development is going to hold it back for 4 hours before it lets it go. So this development's runoff can get through before this one comes down. So there are some ways to look at it that way. The other thing is that Upper South, when they were doing their analysis of the properties, they looked at high infiltration soils, and they wanted to make sure that soils that had the best infiltration potential were part of that preserved open space. So that then again, they could direct their stormwater from that development into those areas to maximize infiltration so that the least amount of water possible is leaving the site.
Well, the EAS, in response to
Yes.
Mark's question,
Yep.
the EAS that we already have written into our saldo would also help as long as there are enforced waivers on granted to the developer.
Right.
That, you know.
And they're actually in zoning too, so
Yeah,
they're a little more
it's
restricted.
certainly in there, but I think they're in the calculation in our saldo too.
Yeah, for the-
How possible.
And so they're sort of a carrying capacity calculation, because you have properties that are more encumbered by natural resources are going to have less potential development than properties that aren't. And so that does get that.
Yeah, I know New York State does a lot with, trying to conserve areas outside large metropolitan areas for their quality of water and quantity of water. Has there been anything like that done in the southeastern Pennsylvania region? I mean, that would certainly influence.
Aqua PA owns the water in the Green Lane Reservoir, and they own all kinds of area around the Green Lane Reservoir as water quality protection area. So Aqua PA is doing that exact same thing.
So I guess my extended question would be, would they have input on, for instance, land planning in various municipalities to support their objectives?
They haven't.
So they use Green Lane as a reservoir that they, in dry periods of release so they can still have water for their Pickering Creek plant in Phoenixville essentially. But yeah, Delaware River Basin Commission has preserved a lot of lands in upstate New York, both in part because of the benefit of the infiltration that occurs to keep the Delaware River River running, but it's primarily for water quality. So it's just a great big riparian buffer to make sure that development doesn't pollute the water source for all of New York City. They've looked at it from a natural features preservation standpoint and water quality. So are you asking what properties would best be preserved for water quality?
Well, not so much that, because obviously that's site-specific to an area outside ours, but I mean, what criteria did they use to determine those properties? And perhaps we can use that as a means to start to prioritize, or at least work with some of our priorities for natural area conservation here in our township. I guess, I might defer that question to our new environmental advisory committee, but, that certainly, I think, should, has credibility for input into our decision-making process for open space preservation.
Okay. So we were on the natural resource protection, so we said the riparian buffers. Tree canopy is another thing that we can look at. Trees have a lot of benefits. Again, we talk about sustainability, talk about streams. They need trees. It's not just preserving the land around the streams. They actually should be forested and wooded. So that's one thing we can look at. We have really good mapping now for tree canopy, and looking at what your tree canopy is and improving it. That would be through tree planting.